The 1990s were supposed to be gaming's great leap forward. CDs would replace cartridges, polygons would replace sprites, and that glorious little number on the box would climb from 8-bit to 16, 32, and even 64-bit. More bits meant more power. More power meant better games. Simple, right? Not even close. Because behind the decade's biggest winners was a graveyard of machines that were too expensive, too confusing, too early, too late, or just too damn weird. One of them made you play Zelda with a television remote. Another strapped a red headache generator to your face. But these failures were not isolated accidents. Each one exposed a weakness that the next company tried to solve, usually by creating an entirely new disaster. And one broken business deal helped create both one of the strangest failures and the machine that eventually crushed almost all of them. Our story begins in 1990 with the Amstrad GX4000, a sleek white console that looked surprisingly futuristic. Underneath, however, it was basically an Amstrad CPC Plus computer without the keyboard. That was the problem. The GX4000 launched in Europe for £99, but its 8-bit hardware was entering a market already hypnotized by the Mega Drive and preparing for the Super Nintendo. Ocean Software produced colorful cartridge games like Burnin' Rubber, but many titles felt like upgraded computer conversions rather than reasons to buy an entirely new machine. Reports commonly place sales at roughly 15,000 units, although numbers from this era are seriously iffy. Either way, it vanished within about a year. It looked like tomorrow, but it played like yesterday. So Commodore made the opposite bet in 1991. Amstrad had stripped a computer down and sold it as a console, but Commodore took an excellent computer, added new technology, and disguised the result as a piece of expensive living room furniture. The Commodore CDTV was essentially an Amiga 500 with a single-speed CD-ROM drive, packaged in a black case designed to sit beneath your television. In the United States, it launched at around $999. That bought you multimedia encyclopedias, music discs, educational software, and games controlled with one of the most awkward remote-style controllers ever placed into human hands. Commodore wanted people who were frightened by computers, but those people did not understand why they needed a CDTV. Amiga owners wanted a keyboard and floppy drive, but those were optional extras. So the machine sat between two markets, impressing both and convincing neither. Welcome to the interactive future, the advertising effectively promised. The future apparently required you to spend $1,000 to slowly browse a digital encyclopedia. But the CDTV's failure did not kill the dream. It revealed what manufacturers thought was missing: a company with enough electronics experience to make the multimedia living room feel inevitable. Philips believed it was that company, so it prepared something even more ambitious. The CDI arrived in North America in late 1991 at roughly $799. Its name meant Compact Disc Interactive, and Philips did not initially treat it as a normal games console. It was an educational device, a movie player, a music system, a business presentation machine, and somewhere near the bottom of the box, possibly a games machine too. 5 MHz, but raw specifications were not its biggest issue. The CDI had no clear identity. Early players shipped with remote controls better suited to selecting menu options than dodging enemies, while digital video cartridges were needed for video CD playback and more advanced full-motion video. I remember seeing CDI displays in electronics shops and thinking they looked impossibly sophisticated. Shiny discs, full-motion video, voices coming from game characters. This had to be the future. But the future was asking $799 to play Hotel Mario. Philips gained permission to use Nintendo characters after negotiations surrounding a proposed Nintendo CD system collapsed. That produced 3 infamous Zelda titles and Hotel Mario. Today, those games survive through memes, bizarre animated cutscenes, and dialogue delivered with the energy of someone being held hostage in a recording booth. Yet the CDI was not completely worthless. Titles like Burn Cycle showed genuine ambition, and its multimedia features made sense before home internet access became common. Philips reportedly sold around 1 million CDI players across multiple models before abandoning the platform in 1998. A long lifespan. A respectable number compared with some machines coming later. But as a mainstream games console, the writing was on the wall. The problem, manufacturers decided, was not necessarily the multimedia dream. Maybe Philips had simply built the wrong business around it. So by 1993, when the word multimedia had become pure marketing magic, Electronic Arts founder Trip Hawkins proposed a different solution. Instead of one company selling one strange machine, multiple electronics companies could share a single standard. The result was the 3DO Interactive Multiplayer. The 3DO was not manufactured by one company. Instead, 3DO designed a hardware specification that companies like Panasonic, Gold Star, and Sanyo could license. The theory was clever. Games would work across different manufacturers' machines, just like VHS tapes worked in different VCRs. But that attempt to solve the CDI's identity problem created a pricing problem. Console manufacturers normally sold hardware cheaply and recovered money through game licensing. 99. That price was brutal. The 3DO had impressive hardware, CD-quality audio, and excellent versions of games like Road Rash, Need for Speed, and Super Street Fighter II Turbo. But it also became home to grainy full-motion video, painfully slow-loading, and games where acting appeared to be a crime against humanity. Roughly 2 million systems were reportedly sold before the platform died in 1996. The 3DO was powerful, but business models matter. It tried to sell console hardware like consumer electronics, so it entered battle without the one-weapon successful console makers relied on: subsidized pricing. Commodore could not compete with that hardware, but it already owned something valuable: a huge library of Amiga software. So rather than invent another $1,000 multimedia category, it tried to turn the Amiga into a more direct and affordable games machine. The Amiga CD32 launched in Europe in September 1993 and was marketed as the first 32-bit CD console. Internally, it was closely related to the Amiga 1200, using Commodore's AGA graphics architecture. That meant developers could convert existing Amiga games quickly. Unfortunately, many did exactly that. Instead of showcasing a new generation, the CD32 library filled with ports that still looked and felt like keyboard-driven computer games. The controller was strange. The hardware arrived as Commodore's finances collapsed, and a U.S. patent dispute blocked American inventory at the worst possible moment. Commodore filed for bankruptcy in April 1994. Estimates usually place CD32 sales at around 100,000 units. The console was not killed by one terrible game. It was killed because the company behind it ran out of road. But the CD32 demonstrated something important. Simply printing 32-bit on a machine was now enough to position it as the future. Even if the software still belonged to the past, Atari saw that numbers could communicate power faster than screenshots ever could, so it pushed the same strategy far beyond Commodore's claim. Atari called it the first 64-bit console. Inside were two custom chips, named Tom and Jerry, supported by a familiar Motorola 68000 processor. The bit count was debatable, but the message was beautifully simple. Genesis was 16-bit, 3DO and CD32 were 32-bit, Jaguar was 64-bit. The number had become the message: 99. Tempest 2000 was fantastic. Alien vs. Predator was genuinely atmospheric. But the difficult hardware architecture, tiny controller keypad, delayed Jaguar CD attachment, and weak development support kept the library painfully small. Fewer than 250,000 Jaguars were sold. Atari left the hardware business, and do the math became less of a challenge and more of an autopsy instruction. The Jaguar proved that claiming the largest number was useless if developers could not easily turn that power into games. But while Atari overpromised a 3D future, NEC reacted in the opposite direction. It trusted the strengths that had worked before: detailed 2D graphics, animated characters, and disc-based storytelling. The PC-FX followed in Japan in December 1994. It looked like a small tower PC and specialized in high-quality 2D animation and full-motion video. NEC designed it while the industry was turning violently toward 3D polygons. Sony had seen where the market was going. NEC had built an excellent machine for where it had been. Sales are usually estimated at around 400,000 units. It was not merely in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was the consequence of believing that refinement could beat a technological shift. Sega recognized that shift, but it had millions of Genesis owners who were not ready to abandon their consoles. So instead of choosing between the old generation and the new one, Sega tried to serve both. That decision meant it started competing with itself. 99. You plugged it into the cartridge slot of your Genesis, connected extra cables, inserted another power supply, and created a plastic mushroom that looked like your console had developed a medical condition. Its twin Hitachi SH2 processors could produce impressive results. Virtua Racing Deluxe was excellent, and Star Wars Arcade felt genuinely advanced, but Sega was also preparing the Saturn. So customers were being asked to upgrade the Genesis, while knowing a completely new Sega console was coming. Developers hesitated. Buyers hesitated. Sega hesitated. Roughly 800,000 units were sold, but support collapsed by 1996. Sega had made the same mistake Atari had made years earlier, confusing loyal customers with overlapping hardware. That confusion made the Saturn's launch even more desperate. Sega needed to seize the next generation before Sony could establish itself, so it unexpectedly released the Saturn in the United States on May 11, 1995, 4 months early, for $399. Retailers were unprepared, developers were furious, and Sony responded at E3 with one devastating number. Saturn was not a total worldwide disaster. It became genuinely successful in Japan, and games like Sega Rally, NIG HTS Into Dreams, and Panzer Dragoon Saga remain extraordinary. 26 million units globally. For many companies, 9 million would be survival. For Sega, it was the beginning of the end. Sony was winning by making 3D gaming easier to buy and easier to develop for, but Nintendo refused to answer with another television box. Instead, it chased a more radical form of immersion. The result was the decade's most physically uncomfortable failure. 95. Designed by Gunpei Yokoi's team, it used oscillating mirrors to create stereoscopic images in shades of red and black. The NEC V810 processor was capable, and games like Virtual Boy Wario Land proved the system had potential. But you could not wear it like a modern VR headset. You hunched over a tabletop stand, pressing your face into the visor while the outside world wondered whether they should call an ambulance. The red display caused complaints of eye strain and nausea, multiplayer was practically non-existent, and the system had only 22 games worldwide. Nintendo discontinued it in under a year after roughly 770,000 sales. I still love how bold it was. That is the tragedy. The Virtual Boy was not lazy. It was a fascinating idea released before the technology could make it comfortable, affordable, or even remotely cool looking. By this point, the lesson seemed obvious. Customers wanted a clear games machine, not a confused multimedia appliance. But Apple's Pippin arrived in 1996 and somehow learned nothing from the CDTV, CDI, or 3DO. Based on Macintosh technology and manufactured primarily by Bandai, it used a 66 MHz PowerPC 603 processor and launched in the United States at $599. It wanted to be a console, computer, internet appliance, and multimedia player. So once again, it became none of them. Only around 42,000 units were reportedly sold. Apple soon returned under Steve Jobs, simplified its product line, and quietly stepped away from the wreckage. Nintendo, meanwhile, had watched CDs create cheaper games and larger worlds, but it remained committed to cartridges for the Nintendo 64. So it tried to recover some of the missing advantages with one final, delayed compromise. The Nintendo 64DD arrived in December 1999. This magnetic disc add-on sat beneath the Nintendo 64, offering writable 64 MB discs, a real-time clock, and the RANnet online service. But years of delays destroyed its momentum, so it launched only in Japan and received just 10 software releases. Estimates suggest roughly 15,000 units were sold, and now the connection hiding beneath this entire graveyard finally comes into focus. Years earlier, Nintendo had worked with Sony on a CD-ROM attachment for the Super Nintendo, but Nintendo backed away from the deal and publicly aligned with Philips instead. That broken partnership helped give Philips the opportunity to produce those notorious Nintendo CDI games. But Sony did not walk away. It turned its abandoned Nintendo project into the PlayStation. So the decade's strangest failure and its biggest winner were born from the same corporate divorce. The CDI helped persuade the industry that multimedia was the future. So 3DO tried to standardize it. The 3DO's price showed that power meant nothing without an affordable business model, so Commodore and Atari sold simpler promises built around bit counts. Their weak libraries proved numbers meant nothing without developers, but Sega answered by launching too much hardware too quickly. That confusion gave Sony exactly the opening it needed. While CDI struggled with remote controls, Jaguar shouted about bits, Sega buried the Genesis under attachments, and Nintendo stared into a red plastic visor. Sony offered developers cheap CDs, straightforward licensing, powerful 3D hardware, and an audience ready for something new. That is the real history of 1990s console failures. Most were not simply bad machines, they were warnings. The GX4000 proved new plastic could not hide old technology. The 3DO proved power could not defeat price. The Jaguar proved marketing could not replace software. The 32X proved loyalty had limits. The Virtual Boy proved innovation without comfort was just punishment. And somehow, that makes me miss them. Because every ridiculous controller, spinning disc, tangled power cable, and doomed launch represented a company gambling on what gaming might become. Most lost, but every failure pushed the next company toward a better answer, until one abandoned partnership turned an entire decade of mistakes into the future we eventually got. Which failed console would you rescue from the graveyard, and what game would you give it? Share your choice in the comments, and if this brought back a few wonderfully awkward memories, consider liking and subscribing. You'll be glad you did.